Well, U.S. President Donald Trump has yet to concede to Joe Biden after the presidential election. He has ordered further troop withdrawals from Afghanistan and Iraq. The plan will cut the number of troops in the two countries by 2,500. The president has also reportedly explored options for an attack on Iran's primary nuclear site, following reports that Iran has substantially increased its reserves of nuclear material. Is reduction of U.S. troops a responsible move at this moment? How could this affect peace negotiations in Afghanistan? And what could the consequences of a U.S. strike on Iranian nuclear site be? To answer these questions, I'm pleased to be joined by Teng Jianqun, Director for the Center of Arms Control at the China Institute of International Studies, Peter Kuznick, Professor of History at the American University, Dr. Omar Sharifi, Country Director with the American Institute of Afghanistan Studies, and Ganbar Nadari, columnist at Kayhan International. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Wang Mengmeng. So President Trump has long been calling for troops to return home, and people have been expecting a withdrawal, but perhaps not so soon and not on this scale. So do you think he's trying to, deliver on his campaign promise, or are there other strategic calculations involved here?
Yeah, right. This is a commitment given by President Donald Trump during the presidential election in 2016. He gave such a promise to withdraw U.S. troops from some other countries in the world, and this is only one reason for the withdrawal of troops. Another reason, this is actually a continuation of the withdrawal of U.S. troops, which was initiated in 2011 by former President Barack Obama, and he ended the 10 years anti-terrorism war in that year, and he withdrew troops from Iraq, from Afghanistan, and also other countries, including the NATO members, withdrew troops from these two countries. So this is a continuation of the withdrawal of troops, by the U.S. government.
Yeah, and the deadline of this drawdown is January 15th, just days before the new administration comes into office. So, Professor Kuznick, what do you make of the timing?
Clearly, Trump is trying to put Biden in a very, very difficult situation right here. This is going to, first of all, this is the strangest transition we've ever seen from one administration to another. Trump has not given permission to his people to even talk to the Biden transition team. So they've not been having meetings. The fact that this is going to happen now so precipitously, right before Biden gets in, means he's going to hand this situation to Biden, and Biden's going to have fewer options. So Trump is trying to get credit for withdrawing down the troops, but he's doing it typically Trumpian, totally irresponsible way of doing it.
Yeah, well, Dr. Sharifi, let me get your thoughts on this. Why is President Trump withdrawing the troops now and with such a number?
Thank you. I mean, people a lot say that President Trump is doing this because of it's just fulfilling his election promises. But I perfectly remember in 2017 in which President Trump gave a speech when he actually increased the number of troops in Afghanistan, and he said that any change of troops, any change of policy regarding Afghanistan and in general Central South Asian region will be depend on, or will be kind of guided by the realities on the ground. So I'm not sure if that is actually a fulfillment of the promise, but if it's a promise, then why in 2017 he said that? But at the end of the day, what is actually clear from experience of the President Trump's period and from an Afghan perspective, it's always, from our perspective, it was very much defined by chaotic and by chaos and by kind of lack of, in a way, kind of in a strategic outlook and what to do. In a way, Afghanistan case, I think that there's a kind of an understanding here in Kabul and around the country that what President Trump's decision on what to do with the troops, what to deal in terms of the war on terror, in terms of dealing with the Taliban, with the terrorists, with Al-Qaeda, and all these groups. It's nothing to do with actually any strategic calculation, and has to do more with the United States domestic politics. So in that situation, all we can just say is that from the very beginning it was defined by uncertainty, and I suppose until 21st of January that will be, in a way, defined by uncertainty.
Yeah, a great deal of uncertainty here, but let's look at the security situation in the two countries, Afghanistan and Iraq. There are currently 4,500 boots on the ground in Afghanistan, and that number will come down to 200 and 2,500. That's pretty significant. And also the number in Iraq will be cut by 500 to 2,500. So will the remaining troops be able to, continue on with their work? And is the Afghan army strong enough to really stand against terrorists just by themselves, Mr. Tang?
No, I don't think we can do that, because such a small number of troops deployed in the two countries cannot, deter the expansion of terrorism and some other non-state actors playing in these games. And there were about 1,000,000 troops deployed, U.S. troops deployed in Afghanistan in 2010. And such a large number could not deal with the challenges of terrorism and some other groups. How can 2,000, 500 U.S. troops can do that job? So this is actually a challenge for the United States. How can the country, the United States and Afghanistan or Iraq, manage the situation? Actually, in recent years we have witnessed the deterioration of the security situation in these two countries. So I think this is a very crucial moment for Afghanistan and for Iraq. How can the two governments maintain the peace and stability after the withdrawal of U.S. troops and some other countries' withdrawal of troops? Yeah.
How are the security situations different in these two countries, Professor Kuznick?
The situation in Iraq is a little bit more stable right now. The Iraqi parliament actually asked the United States to leave after the killing of Soleimani. So in Iraq, they're prepared for the U.S. to leave, and they think they can handle the situation. Iranians will certainly increase their influence in Iraq, and that's inevitable at the moment. In Afghanistan, the situation is much more unstable. The Taliban have actually been increasing their attacks. The United States has been bombing them in Kandahar. If not for that, then the Taliban would have a strong presence in Kandahar right now. The insurgency is actually intensifying in many parts of the country, especially the south and the west. And these peace talks have been stalled. So there's not a lot of progress there. And the thinking is that the U.S. troop withdrawal will give the Taliban increased leverage and strengthen their position during these peace talks. So we're in a bad situation, but the United States has been involved in these countries for a very long time. We're talking 2 decades almost. And the American people are, for the most part, very, very tired of these never-ending wars. So Trump has tapped into that sentiment in the United States. And it's a sentiment shared by the right and by the left in the United States. So, and Biden also shares much of that attitude about the need to get out of these forever wars, as did Obama. So this a general sense in the United States of war weariness, fatigue, and it's time for that region to figure out its own problems.
Yeah, well, Dr. Sharifi, will the withdrawal make things even worse for Afghanistan? Because as Professor Kuznick just mentioned, the peace talks between the Taliban and the Afghan government, have been dragging on, and attacks have been rising in Afghanistan.
Well, just to clarify certain things, when the United States increased its troops in Afghanistan in 2010, in that time the Afghan army, Afghan defense forces were actually almost in its inception phase. It was just was forming. 10 years later, the Afghan army is actually taking the brunt of the fight. And if we look around the role of the international forces in Afghanistan, it's primarily, and I repeat, primarily in support role, which they provide, which is very important by itself. It's some logistics and also sometimes air cover, not all the time. So what happens after the peace talks, and that the Taliban actually, the way the peace talks was conducted was in a way was to almost delegitimize the Afghan government, and on the other hand gave the Taliban a huge platform internationally, something that they'd lacked. And then I'm not sure if the peace talks actually ever mentioned something about kind of sustained peace, the way it was conducted between the United States and the Taliban. And then the Taliban immediately after, like in the fall, started a massive operations across the country. They moved their troops from Pakistan and they attacked across the country, especially in the southern areas. But so far, they almost have no gains in the sense. So what we're feeling today, what we're seeing today, assuming that the United States completely cut its all relationships and move away, that's a clear danger. But what if we learn from history, no Afghan government in the course of history ever fallen to an insurgency as long as it has an international support. We had the same thing in the 19th century and early 20th century. So, and to just Professor Kuznick, he mentioned that the region has to take care of its own problems. And in one way, I kind of say it might make sense, but on the other hand, what we're dealing here in Afghanistan, just not the Taliban. The Taliban, Taliban is kind of, it's sort of international, it's kind of, they approach Taliban as some sort of a monolithic entity. But the reality on the ground is rather different. And that is what we talk about the Taliban. We actually talk about many different groups, from Central Asian, Uzbekistani groups, from like Pakistani-based groups, from like the Middle Eastern groups, and even some things from some Chinese and Filipinos groups who actually actively since 1990s were operating with the Taliban. And even today, there is absolutely no evidence in which Al-Qaeda and ISIS and all these Central Asian groups who were active with the Taliban are not cooperating with them. They actually do cooperate with them. And in recent weeks, the Afghan army actually picked up the head of the Uzbekistani Islamist groups in the border in the north, and they had the Al-Qaeda from South Asia, the head of the deputy of the Al-Qaeda in South Asia, and a Taliban-controlled area in the border of Iran. So what we're seeing today, it's like Afghan government and Afghan army is not just facing some sort of an domestic insurgency, but actually dealing with far more sophisticated phenomenon. But it's kind of a tendency has been so far since 2016, or actually I have to say since 2014,
right,
to kind of portray Taliban as some sort of a monolithic entity with very Afghan agenda. And I don't agree with that.
Well, the complexity of the security situation there makes President Trump's decision to withdraw troops from Afghanistan and Iraq a great source of alarm. And people have been, saying things about this decision. Let's take a look at what people have been saying on social media. So, well, of course, there's a great deal of debate, and this one, named Tyler, says that what happens if you pull out completely? The Afghan government collapses and the Taliban or someone worse than them sweeps into power. We saw what happened in Iraq after all U.S. forces pulled out. We should be concerned about the same happening in Afghanistan. I think he meant by the pullout of U.S. combat forces in 2011, in 2014, under the Obama administration. So could history repeat itself? Professor Kuznick.
That's the danger, that history definitely can repeat itself. There's a good chance that the Taliban and related forces will make strong gains in Afghanistan. The army is stronger. The United States has been training, and NATO has been training the Afghan army for years. And I remember the early reports about the Afghan army and how weak it was and how backward it was, but it's been strengthened over the years. It can stand up, at least for a while, certainly. But the problem is that the United States is not withdrawing entirely right now. There's going to still be 2,500 people there. But they're going to still continue some counterinsurgency efforts. They're going to still continue the training. So this situation is going to drag on for quite some time still. The United States has been talking about a shift, the pivot that Hillary Clinton wrote about in November 2011 when her article in Foreign Policy magazine titled America's Pacific Century, talked about shifting from the Middle East to the Pacific, that China is really the strategic threat to the United States, that the U.S. is going to pivot its forces. There's been that attitude in the previous administration, to some extent in the Trump administration, and I think we're going to see it again in the Biden administration. So we're going to have to figure out solutions in that region that are not going to require as much American military presence, but that does not mean the United States cutting off aid in that area. So it's certainly complicated because it also involves Pakistan. It also involves India. I mean, this is a much broader regional problem. So if we begin to resolve some of the other conflicts, and maybe some of these countries can begin working together with Russian help and Chinese help, maybe we can come to a peaceful resolution of this situation there.
Yeah. Well, there have been major shakeups at the White House last week. Trump fired Defense Secretary Secretary Mark Esper because Esper and his team have been reportedly trying to push back this withdrawal plan. So why did the President and the Defense Secretary have different opinions on this issue?
This is actually a geopolitical game played by the United States, and not only the former Secretary of State Esper, but also Mattis was fired by President Trump just because of the dispute over the withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan, from Iraq. So this is actually a dispute between the President, the top leader of the United States, and the defense leaders in the United States, just because of the geopolitical interests. This Afghanistan and Iraq are very important countries in this region, which gave support for the United States to, expand its influence and its presence in this region, and to protect its own interests, and also protect the interests of its allies, for example, Israel and Saudi Arabia. So I don't think the defense leaders, including the Secretary of Defense, can give such an order to completely withdraw all the troops of the United States in the Middle East. This is a mistake. If you look at the history in the year of 2011, President Obama withdrew the troops from Iraq, and then the extremist groups, Islamic State, just gave such expansion and did a lot of trouble in that region, and the U.S. troops had to return to that area to fight against the terrorist groups. So this is actually a history we should learn, and the United States should learn how can deal with the challenges in that area, not only for the United States but also for the regional countries and the world. This is actually a challenge for the whole international community.
Yeah, and not just the Pentagon. The political circles in the U.S. are also divided over the plans, and not necessarily along party lines, because we've seen some Democrats supporting the reduction plan and some, Democrats, Republicans oppose them. What are the main sticking points here, Professor Kuznick?
Well, this new Secretary of Defense, who replaced Esper, is pretty much of a yes man to Trump. He's a Trump loyalist. The person who was brought in as his chief deputy is a Colonel Douglas Macgregor. Macgregor fought in Afghanistan and Iraq. Macgregor is really a hardliner when it comes to troop withdrawals. He wants to get all the U.S. troops out of Afghanistan, and I'm pretty sure he wants to do the same in Iraq. So the problem is that under Trump especially, the United States has had no strategic plan to deal with the region. Yeah. Trump made a campaign pledge that he's going to pull the troops out. Now he's trying to fulfill that campaign pledge. But America's history in that region has been sordid from the beginning. The U.S. got involved in Afghanistan in a big way back in 1979, when Brzezinski convinced Carter that the United States should support the Mujahideen because it would force the Soviet Union to militarily intervene in the situation in Afghanistan. the Mujahideen the U.S. was supporting was rebelling against the Soviet-friendly government because the Soviet-friendly government was doing land reform and was allowing the education of women and wanted to industrialize. So the U.S. got involved there from the beginning on a rotten basis, reactionary basis, simply to stir this up. Brzezinski said, I want to give the Soviets their own Vietnam. Then Brezhnev took the bait, invaded on Christmas Day, and it's been a mess ever since with the U.S. involvement and others in the region. So we have to begin to think about broader regional solutions to these problems there. There are no, as other guests have been saying, there are no easy solutions here. But you have to have a broader strategic vision, which has been totally lacking from day one in this Trump administration. The Trump administration has been obsessed with Iran. That's the real fixation for Trump.
Yeah.
They want, almost everybody in this administration, in top official positions, has wanted to go after Iran. So they're Iran-phobic, basically. And Mattis, who had been demoted previously because he was so such a hawk on Iran, was actually the responsible one. He was the adult in the Trump administration who was tried to prevent them from military action in Iran. As we've seen, they're still obsessed with Iran, and Trump wanted last week to get military options for an attack on Iran.
Yeah, indeed. This withdrawal plan certainly has ramifications beyond just Afghanistan and Iraq. Iran, as you mentioned, President Trump reportedly asked senior aides last week about the possibility of launching a major offensive strike on Iran's primary nuclear site. Was he being serious, Dr. Sharifi?
You mean, if I got your questions correctly, you mean President Trump's plan to invade Iranian facilities, nuclear facilities? Correct? You are. Okay, I'm not sure actually. I'm not sure how much actually it's feasible given the time and given the preparation for such such kind of act. But at the same time, at least witnessing the Donald Trump's presidency, we cannot rule out anything because we're dealing with a very unique situation in which the United States, in which institutions in the United States are becoming increasingly actually sidelined. We're not dealing actually with a kind of a strategic vision of the United States towards the region, but actually perhaps some interests, and even sometimes just whim. So, I mean, but just to kind of affirm the consequence of it on Afghanistan, any kind of further escalation of the conflict, any attack on Iran and everything, I think that might be a catastrophe for Afghanistan and for the entire peace process in Afghanistan. And I have to say that after the President Trump's decision on, in a way, cancelling or revoking the nuclear treaty with Iran, we've witnessed that Iranians actually stepped up their support for some elements of the Taliban in Western Afghanistan as kind of a retaliatory measure towards the United States and towards Afghanistan. And I think that, as I said, it will be another catastrophe, and I hope it will be avoided at any cost.
Yeah. Well, so why do you think he's considering such a move, even considering such a move at this time in the closing weeks of his presidency?
A retaliation. This is very simple. You know, there are at least two opportunities for President John Trump to initiate a military strike against Iran. One was on June 20th, last year, when Iranian shut down the drone of the United States, of U.S. military, and another is on January 8th this year, after Iranian military strike the military base in Iraq, U.S. military base in Iraq. At that time, Donald Trump said, no, we cannot do that because the presidential election was coming at that time. And this time, after the presidential election, there is no pressure for the continuation to be leader of the United States for Donald Trump. So he would like to retaliate this military action, and also he would like to strike Iran and give the protection of his allies, for example, Israel, just by the military strike, but such a military strike would be disaster, as the professor mentioned. That will be a whole war in the Middle East. And I don't think the U.S. military has been well prepared to deal such a large-scale war in that region.
Yeah. And on Tuesday, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said that the price for leaving too soon or in an uncoordinated way could be very high. Dr. Sharifi, what do you think he meant by that? And is such an open criticism unusual?
I believe that NATO countries and NATO as an organization has invested a lot in Afghanistan, and at least I think that is, if I'm not mistaking it, it's the first kind of out of Europe mission of the NATO in which I said not only the credibility of the organization but actually its capacities are in question. So NATO came to Afghanistan to take a very important role in training the Afghan security forces in terms of and also providing some logistical supports for the Afghan security. So I believe what we're seeing about kind of following Secretary General of the NATO is the transatlantic alliance that kind of started out from like World War II, and I think it's in crisis right now. But at the same time, it's too soon to say what will be the consequences of that, because we still wait until to see what happens on January 21st. And my understanding is after January 21st, if President Biden come to power and stuff, we expect something of more organized and at least more, in a way, understandable kind of relationship between the United States and Afghan government, and actually in terms of the entire peace process with the Taliban. And I believe the NATO can play a very important role. And now if the United States suddenly withdraw everything and kind of leave everything behind, given that they came together, it was the United States who actually asked NATO to join in this adventure, or this venture I can say, after like 21st of January, I think there will be a great challenge for the whole credibility of this entire transatlantic relationship. But I believe that after President Biden, we may see a possible kind of more structured relationship between the United States and the government of Afghanistan, and actually between the international community with the United States and NATO towards the whole peace process.
Let me just leave you there for a second, because Ganbar Nadari is able to join us now, and we want to get his take on this. Biden has expressed a willingness to return to the nuclear deal Trump has pulled out from. So do you think that Iran could possibly accept this return to the deal that could be, torn apart again, given the political uncertainty in the country?
Well, that's a good question. Many are asking the same. Well, Biden is more than welcome to return to the nuclear deal within the framework of the JCPOA, and of course after consultations with the remaining signatories to the deal, which include Russia, China, the European Union countries, and of course the UN Security Council. The problem is not whether Joe Biden wants to return to the deal. The problem is that he has so far refused to say that he would also lift the sanctions against Iran, the unilateral sanctions, after Trump walked out of that deal more than 3 years ago. So if they want to return to the deal, the administration of Biden is more than welcome. But for that to happen, the U.S. needs to lift the sanctions regime, and at the same time, the U.S. has to pay for all those that it has incurred on the Iranian government and people. I'm talking about hundreds of billions of dollars in lost oil trade and international business. So it is not going to be an easy comeback for the U.S. government. And no, Iran is not going to talk about anything else except finding a way to pave the way for the return of the United States government to this important international agreement.
Yeah, it remains to be seen whether the new administration could come up with a much more clear path forward in the region. Thank you so much. We want to thank our panel, Mr. Teng Jianjun here in Beijing, and Dr. Omar Sharifi, Mr. Ganbar Nadari. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Wang Mengmeng. See you next time.